The version of you that survived your past will not survive your future. And that's not a threat, it's a necessity. The persona is the version of you that learned how to survive the world. It is not who you are, it is who you became in response to pressure. Built unconsciously, piece by piece, it formed through approval, rejection, reward, and punishment. Every smile that earned safety, every silence that avoided conflict, every role that made you feel accepted. Over time, this survival mask hardened into an identity, and you began mistaking adaptation for authenticity. The persona is efficient. It knows how to function, how to be liked, how to avoid discomfort. It speaks when it should speak, stays quiet when it should stay quiet, and performs whatever role is required to maintain belonging. But what it gains in acceptance, it loses in truth. It trades depth for predictability. It replaces instinct with strategy. And slowly, it distances you from your own inner life. The danger of the persona is not that it exists, but that it overstays its purpose. What once protected you eventually begins to imprison you. The behaviors that helped you cope in one phase of life become limitations in the next. You keep reacting instead of choosing. You keep pleasing instead of expressing. You keep shrinking instead of expanding. The persona resists growth because growth threatens the structure it relies on. As awareness increases, the cracks begin to show. You notice the exhaustion that comes from maintaining appearances, the quiet resentment of always being the responsible one, the strong one, the agreeable one, the subtle emptiness that follows external success without internal alignment. These are not signs of failure. They are signals that the persona can no longer carry the weight of your psyche. The persona fears exposure more than anything. It survives by maintaining coherence, by keeping contradictions hidden, by suppressing impulses that don't fit the image. But the unconscious does not cooperate forever. What is repressed accumulates energy. What is denied demands expression. And eventually, the internal tension becomes impossible to ignore. This is when the persona begins to die, not suddenly, but through destabilization. Old motivations lose their power. Familiar roles feel artificial. The things that once gave you certainty now feel hollow. You may experience confusion, irritability, or a sense of losing direction. This is not regression. It is the psyche withdrawing energy from a false center. The collapse of the persona often feels like a personal failure because the persona equates itself with your worth. When it weakens, it interprets that weakening as danger. It tells you something is wrong, that you are losing control, that you should return to what worked before. But what worked before worked only because you were smaller then. The persona cannot survive self-observation. The moment you see it clearly, how it performs, how it manipulates, how it avoids, the illusion begins to dissolve. You can no longer fully inhabit a role once you recognize it as a role. Consciousness disrupts automation. Awareness interrupts repetition. And the persona depends entirely on unconscious identification. As the persona loses dominance, deeper material begins to surface. Traits you disowned, emotions you suppressed, desires you judged as unacceptable. This emergence can feel destabilizing because the persona acted as a gatekeeper. Without it, the psyche opens, contradictions appear, ambivalence replaces certainty. You realize you are not as simple or as consistent as you believed. The persona dies because it cannot integrate complexity. It was designed for social navigation, not psychological wholeness. It simplifies the self to remain acceptable. But development demands expansion, and expansion requires confronting what the persona excluded. This death is not violent, but it is relentless. The more conscious you become, the less the persona can pretend. It loses authority. It loses credibility. It loses its ability to convince you that safety lies in conformity. And as it weakens, a deeper organizing center begins to form, one that does not depend on approval, performance, or borrowed identities. The persona does not vanish without resistance. It will attempt to reassert itself through nostalgia, fear, and self-doubt. It will remind you of how things used to be, of who you used to be, of what you might lose. But what it offers is familiarity, not truth. And familiarity no longer satisfies once insight has begun to take root. The death of the persona is the psyche reclaiming its energy. It is the withdrawal from a mask that has completed its function. It is the beginning of an inner reorientation where identity is no longer dictated by external demand, but shaped by internal necessity. It is the moment the self stops asking how to fit in and starts asking what must be integrated. The moment you truly see yourself, you lose the ability to go back, and most people spend their lives running from that moment. Awareness does not arrive as relief. It arrives as disruption. It enters an unconscious flow of habits, reactions, and identities that once operated without resistance. Before awareness, life feels automatic. You move through roles, routines, and relationships guided by impulses you do not question. After awareness, nothing moves without friction. Every pattern becomes visible. Every contradiction demands attention. And once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. Awareness exposes the machinery of the mind. You begin to notice how thoughts arise not as truths, but as conditioned responses. You observe emotional reactions forming before logic intervenes. You catch yourself justifying behaviors you once believed were natural. This observation creates distance between you and your inner processes, and that distance changes everything. You are no longer fused with your reactions. You are watching them. This separation is irreversible. Once you recognize that you are not your thoughts, you cannot return to believing them blindly. But once you see how fear disguises itself as logic, how desire masks itself as necessity, how avoidance presents itself as preference, you lose the innocence that allowed unconscious repetition. Awareness dissolves the comfort of certainty. What makes awareness dangerous is that it removes excuses. Before awareness, behavior feels inevitable. You react because you are that way. You repeat patterns because they feel familiar. You remain in situations because you tell yourself there is no alternative. Awareness introduces choice, and choice introduces responsibility. You are no longer acting from compulsion alone. You are participating in your own behavior. This is where many people resist awareness. They sense that seeing clearly will demand change. Not because someone tells them to change, but because incongruence becomes unbearable. When you see that your actions contradict your values, tension arises. When you see that your identity is built on avoidance, discomfort increases. Awareness creates an internal conflict that cannot be resolved by distraction. The psyche is structured to seek coherence. When awareness reveals fragmentation, when you see that different parts of you want opposing things, the pressure to integrate intensifies. You cannot unknow that your silence is a strategy. You cannot unknow that your anger is displaced. You cannot unknow that your self-image is curated. Awareness brings all of this into conscious space, where it demands engagement. Once awareness deepens, repetition feels heavier, old habits lose their neutrality. You feel the cost of every unconscious choice. Procrastination is no longer just delay. It is avoidance you recognize in real time. People-pleasing is no longer kindness. It is fear of disapproval you can name. Self-sabotage is no longer mysterious. It is a defense mechanism you observe activating. This clarity does not free you immediately. It confronts you. Awareness also destabilizes identity. You realize that much of what you thought was you is a collection of learned responses. Your preferences, opinions, and reactions reveal their origins in conditioning. This realization can feel like disintegration. If you are not the patterns you observe, then who are you? The mind resists this question because it cannot be answered quickly or comfortably. The point of no return occurs when awareness begins to self-sustain. At first, insight comes in flashes, moments of clarity followed by regression. But eventually, observation becomes continuous. You start noticing yourself noticing. Reflection turns inward automatically. At this stage, even unconscious behavior is accompanied by awareness of its unconsciousness. The psyche has crossed a threshold. From here, denial becomes difficult. You can still choose to act against your awareness, but the cost increases. Every compromise with truth generates inner tension. Every rationalization feels thin. Every distraction feels deliberate. Awareness strips unconsciousness of its protective function. It removes the buffer that once softened the consequences of self-betrayal. This is why awareness feels isolating. You realize that many social agreements rely on shared unconsciousness. Polite lies, unspoken resentments, and collective distractions become visible. You notice how often people avoid depth, deflect responsibility, or perform identities. This perception creates distance, not because you feel superior, but because you see the mechanisms at work. Awareness demands integration. It pushes you toward aligning action with insight. The psyche does not tolerate prolonged division between what is known and what is done. This pressure is not moral. It is structural. When consciousness expands, the system reorganizes itself to accommodate the new information. Anything incompatible with awareness begins to break down. The old ways of coping stop working. Numbing becomes less effective. Escapism loses its appeal. You cannot fully disappear into distraction when part of you remains awake, observing the escape. Awareness follows you into every attempt to avoid it. This is the point of no return, not because you are forced forward, but because backward movement no longer offers relief. Awareness does not promise peace. It promises clarity, and clarity carries weight. It demands that you see your role in your suffering, your participation in your stagnation, your contribution to your relationships. It removes the fantasy that change will happen without cost. Once awareness is established, life becomes a dialogue between what is seen and what is lived. You are no longer protected by ignorance. You are guided by recognition. The path ahead is not chosen because it is comfortable, but because it is unavoidable once truth has been perceived. What you reject in yourself doesn't disappear. It waits, grows stronger, and controls you from the dark. The shadow is everything you were taught not to be. It is composed of traits, impulses, emotions, and desires that were rejected early in life because they threatened acceptance or safety. Each time an aspect of you was met with disapproval, punishment, or withdrawal of affection, it was pushed out of conscious identity. What remained became acceptable. What was rejected became hidden. Over time, this division formed the shadow. The shadow is not inherently negative. It is unfinished material. It contains anger that learned it was dangerous to be expressed, confidence that was labeled arrogance, assertiveness that was punished, vulnerability that was ignored, and desire that was shamed. These traits did not disappear, they were exiled. And exiled parts do not become weaker, they become autonomous. When the shadow is unrecognized, it operates indirectly. It influences behavior without being acknowledged. It leaks through sarcasm, passive aggression, sudden emotional reactions, self-sabotage, and projection. The qualities you most strongly judge in others often mirror what you refuse to see in yourself. This is not coincidence. The psyche externalizes what it cannot integrate. The reason the shadow is feared is because it threatens the image you hold of yourself. You want to believe you are rational, kind, controlled, and consistent. The shadow disrupts that narrative. It introduces contradiction. It reveals that you are capable of impulses you deny, emotions you suppress, and behaviors you disown. The ego interprets this revelation as danger, not because the shadow is destructive, but because it destabilizes identity. Avoiding the shadow requires constant energy. You must monitor yourself, suppress impulses, and maintain appearances. This effort creates inner tension. Over time, that tension manifests as anxiety, rigidity, or emotional numbness. The more intensely you try to be good, the more forcefully the shadow asserts itself in distorted ways. The shadow becomes an enemy only when it is ignored. When you refuse to acknowledge it, it acts without consent. It shapes decisions from behind the scenes. It influences attraction, repulsion, and repetition. Patterns you cannot explain are often driven by shadow material seeking expression. The psyche is not attempting to sabotage you. It is attempting to balance itself. Integration does not mean acting out every impulse. It means recognizing their existence and understanding their origin. Awareness transforms the shadow from a force of disruption into a source of information. Anger reveals boundaries that were crossed. Envy points to unacknowledged desire. Resentment exposes unmet needs. When these signals are ignored, they turn destructive. When they are examined, they become guides. The shadow also contains vitality. Creative energy, assertiveness, ambition, and instinct often reside there because they conflicted with expectations placed on you. When these qualities were suppressed, they did not lose their power. They went dormant. Accessing them requires confronting the fear that originally caused their rejection. Projection is the shadow's primary defense. By seeing unwanted traits in others, you maintain the illusion of purity. But projection comes at a cost. It distorts perception. It traps you in repetitive emotional reactions. You respond not to what is happening, but to what is being activated within you. This keeps relationships shallow and conflict unresolved. The shadow demands recognition, not elimination. Attempts to destroy it only strengthen its autonomy. Moral perfectionism intensifies repression. Spiritual bypassing creates deeper splits. The psyche does not respond to denial. It responds to inclusion. What is seen can be regulated. What is hidden cannot. Facing the shadow requires humility. You must accept that your self-image is incomplete, that you are not only what you approve of. This confrontation often triggers guilt or shame, but those emotions are remnants of the original rejection. As awareness grows, these reactions soften. The shadow loses its threatening quality when it is met without judgment. The goal of integration is not comfort. It is wholeness. When shadow material is acknowledged, energy previously spent on repression becomes available for conscious use. Emotional reactions become proportionate. Relationships become more honest. Choices become less compulsive. You are no longer controlled by what you refuse to see. The shadow is not the enemy, because it does not oppose your development. It insists on it. It carries the parts of you that were left behind in the process of adaptation. Reclaiming them does not make you darker. It makes you more real. The psyche moves toward balance, not perfection. And balance cannot be achieved by cutting off half of what you are. You don't stay stuck. Because you're weak, you stay because familiarity feels safer than truth. Comfort does not announce itself as limitation. It presents itself as relief, stability, and safety. It feels earned. It feels reasonable. Unlike obvious forms of confinement, comfort does not restrict through force. It restricts through satisfaction. It convinces you that nothing more is required, that questioning is unnecessary, that movement can be postponed. In this way, comfort becomes the most effective form of captivity. The psyche gravitates toward what is familiar, not what is true. Familiarity reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is perceived as threat. Even when a situation is unfulfilling, predictable dissatisfaction feels safer than unknown possibility. Comfort thrives on this preference. It offers emotional consistency at the cost of growth. It rewards stagnation with stability. What makes comfort deceptive is that it often emerges from success. You build a life that functions. You create routines that work. You surround yourself with structures that reduce friction. From the outside, it appears healthy. From the inside, something begins to dull. Curiosity weakens. Risk feels irresponsible. Expansion feels unnecessary. The drive that once pushed you forward begins to quiet. Comfort operates by minimizing tension. It removes urgency. It dulls dissatisfaction just enough to prevent action. The mind tells itself there is time, that change can wait, that discomfort would be worse than stagnation. This logic is subtle and convincing. It does not forbid growth. It delays it indefinitely. The prison of comfort is self-maintained. No external force holds you in place. You stay because leaving would disrupt equilibrium. Growth demands instability. Development requires the willingness to tolerate uncertainty, friction, and temporary loss of control. Comfort eliminates these conditions. It protects you from discomfort, but in doing so, it protects you from transformation. Over time, comfort reshapes identity. You begin to define yourself by what you can manage rather than what you could become. Choice is narrow. You avoid challenges that threaten your sense of competence. You stay within the boundaries of what you know you can handle. This self-limitation feels responsible, even mature. But it slowly reduces vitality. Comfort dulls perception. When nothing presses against you, awareness softens. You stop questioning assumptions. You stop examining patterns. You accept explanations that once would have felt incomplete. The mind prefers equilibrium. Comfort provides it, but at the cost of depth. The psyche remains untested, and untested structures weaken. This is why comfort often precedes crisis. When growth is postponed long enough, the unconscious forces change through disruption. What was avoided voluntarily returns involuntarily. Relationships strain. Motivation collapses. Meaning erodes. The psyche demands movement, and if it is not chosen, it is imposed. Comfort also reinforces avoidance. You learn to associate discomfort with danger rather than development. Any signal of inner tensions is numbed, dismissed, or rationalize, this avoidance becomes automatic. You no longer ask whether you are fulfilled, you ask whether you are comfortable. That substitution changes the direction of your life. The most sophisticated aspect of comfort is that it feels deserved. You tell yourself you have earned rest, ease, and predictability, and rest is necessary. But comfort extends beyond rest. It becomes a permanent state. Recovery turns into residence. What was meant to restore you begins to replace engagement. Comfort does not challenge your beliefs. It does not test your values. It does not confront your limitations. It allows you to remain intact but unchanged. The psyche, however, is not designed for stasis. It seeks expansion. When expansion is blocked, energy turns inward, restlessness appears. Irritation grows without a clear cause. A sense of quiet dissatisfaction settles in. Breaking out of comfort feels like betrayal. You feel ungrateful. You question why you would want more when things are fine. But fine is not the same as alive. Comfort keeps you functional, not fulfilled. It maintains form, not vitality. The prison of comfort is difficult to escape because the door is unlocked. You are free to leave at any time. But leaving requires choosing discomfort over familiarity. It requires risking instability for growth. It requires tolerating the anxiety of not knowing who you will become once the old structures dissolve. Comfort does not collapse dramatically. It erodes ambition slowly. It replaces desire with maintenance. It transforms potential into routine. And the longer you remain, the harder it becomes to remember why you once wanted more than this. Nothing new enters your life until something old agrees to die. And the old version of you never agrees willingly. Psychological transformation does not begin with improvement. It begins with collapse. Before anything new can emerge, the existing structure must lose its authority. This loss is not symbolic. It is experienced as disorientation, grief, and the erosion of identity. The psyche does not add a new self on top of the old one. It dismantles what no longer serves development. The first death is the death of certainty. Beliefs that once organized your world begin to fail. Explanations feel incomplete. Values you inherited no longer align with your experience. This destabilization is unsettling because certainty provides coherence. When it dissolves, the mind searches desperately for replacement. But this phase cannot be rushed. Premature answers only recreate the old structure in new language. The second death is the death of identification. You realize that the roles you played were strategies, not essence. Achiever, caretaker, rebel, victim, or savior. These identities once gave meaning and direction. When they weaken, you feel exposed. Without them, you are no longer sure how to behave, what to prioritize, or how to relate. This uncertainty is often mistaken for regression, but it is actually deconstruction. Grief accompanies this process because something real is being lost. Even false identities require investment. They provided belonging, predictability, and purpose. Letting them go feels like betrayal, not only of others, but of your past self. The psyche resists this loss. It tries to revive old narratives, hoping they will regain power. But once their limitations are seen, they cannot fully return. The third death is the death of control. During transformation, outcomes become unpredictable. Strategies that once worked stop producing results. Effort no longer guarantees stability. This loss of control is deeply unsettling because control is equated with safety. The ego attempts to manage the process, to plan rebirth as if it were a project. But rebirth does not follow schedules or intentions. It emerges organically from dissolution. This is the stage where many people retreat. They interpret the discomfort as failure and attempt to reconstruct the old life. But regression feels hollow. The psyche has already withdrawn energy from previous forms. Rebuilding them feels forced. What once felt natural now requires constant effort. This friction is not punishment. It is information. Psychological death also involves the death of defenses. Coping mechanisms that once protected you lose effectiveness. Distraction fails to numb. Rationalization fails to convince. Emotional suppression leaks through the cracks. You are left exposed to raw experience without familiar buffers. This vulnerability is not a weakness. It is the removal of barriers that once prevented deeper contact with yourself. During this phase, emptiness often appears. Motivation disappears. Direction fades. You may feel suspended between who you were and who you are becoming, with no clear reference point. This void is not absence. It is potential. But potential feels like nothing until form begins to emerge. The psyche does not tolerate permanent emptiness. Given enough time and attention, new patterns begin to organize themselves. Not from conscious will, but from deeper necessity. Interests shift. Values reorganize. Energy returns in unfamiliar directions. This is not a return to the old self. It is the formation of a new center. Rebirth does not arrive as a sudden breakthrough. It unfolds gradually as coherence returns. The difference is that this coherence is not imposed. It arises from integration. Contradictions are held rather than eliminated. Ambiguity is tolerated rather than avoided. Identity becomes flexible rather than rigid. The reborn self is quieter but more stable. It does not rely on performance for validation. It is less reactive because it is less divided. It draws energy from alignment rather than effort. This stability is not comfort. It is groundedness. Death before rebirth is not a one-time event. It is a recurring pattern in psychological development. Each stage of growth requires the surrender of previous forms. Resistance prolongs suffering. Acceptance allows movement. The psyche seeks wholeness, not happiness. Wholeness requires the willingness to let structures die when they have completed their function. What emerges afterward is not a perfected version of the old self, but a more integrated expression shaped by what has been consciously endured